Today is the 20th anniversary of the breaching of the Edwards Dam in Augusta.
Over the ensuing few months, the entire dam was removed, opening up 18 miles of free-flowing river.
For 162 years, a wall of timber and concrete blocked one of Maine's greatest rivers, choking 17 miles of water and shutting out a dozen species of fish that had run it since the last ice age. Most people assumed it would stand forever. Then, on one July morning, more than 1,000 people lined the banks to watch a backhoe tear it open. And the moment the river broke free, it did something not a single scientist in that crowd had predicted.
The department was having public hearings, and no one quite understood what the impacts were.
What came next did not take decades. It began in seconds, and nobody who saw it was ready for how far this river was about to go. A river alive. Here is the thing none of them could be sure of that morning. You can knock down a wall in an afternoon. Bringing back a river that has been strangled for a century and a half is a completely different question.
There were a few protesters on hand, people claiming that this is not enough to clean up or completely free the Kennebec and other rivers, but by and large, people were celebrating.
To understand why that question terrified the people who spent years fighting for this moment, and why the answer ended up rewriting the rules for the entire country, you have to go back to what this river was before anyone laid a single stone across it. Picture the Kennebec in 1837. Back then, it was one of the most alive rivers on the whole eastern seaboard. Every single spring, the water turned to silver because fish came pouring in from the Atlantic by the millions. This one river hosted all 10 species of sea-run fish native to Maine. 10. You cannot find that anywhere in one place today. Atlantic salmon climbed it, American shad and several kinds of herring packed into it. Shortnose and Atlantic sturgeon, some of them 10 feet long, rolled through the deep pools. And then there were the alewives, a small, plain little river herring you would never look at twice. But they came back in numbers that are almost impossible to picture now. At its peak, this river carried more than 6 million adult alewives in a single season. 6 million. And here is what most people miss about that fish. The alewife is the foundation under everything else. Think about what that actually means. Out at sea, those alewives fed the cod, the striped bass, the bluefish. Up along the banks, they fed the eagles, the otter, the great blue heron. The whole system ran on them. The alewives spent most of their lives in the ocean, then swam back by the million into the fresh water where they were born, hauling nutrients from the sea deep inland on their own backs. Everything timed its year around that return. Pull the alewives out, and the entire machine starts to seize up. For thousands of years, nobody pulled them out. The river just ran, full and loud and packed with life. And then, in a single building season, all of it got walled off. The wall rises. People saw it coming, and they fought it. In February of 1834, the people of the Kennebec Valley basically went to war over a plan to dam their river. Petitions flooded the state legislature. One of them warned the project would drag the business of the whole county into bondage. They were not being dramatic. This was, at the time, the single largest dam project ever attempted in the United States. The people who wanted it built one anyway. In 1837, the Kennebec Dam Company finished its barrier across the river at Augusta, just below the head of tide, about 40 miles up from the Atlantic. 24 feet high, more than 900 feet across, a wall of timber and concrete splitting the river clean in two. The builders included a fish ladder, a little gesture toward the salmon and shad that had been using this river since long before any European ever showed up in Maine. On paper, the fish could still get through. In reality, that promise lasted less than a year. In the spring of 1838, a flood tore the fish ladder away, and the owners made a choice that would lock this river in place for the next century and a half. They just did not rebuild it. That was it. The door slammed on nearly a dozen migratory species that had climbed this river since the last ice age. 17 miles of rapids and spawning gravel went quiet behind the wall. And here is the part almost everyone forgets. The river spent the next 140 years trying to take that wall back down on its own. It breached in a flood in 1839, again in 1846, again in 1855. Every time, the owners patched it and rebuilt. The river kept saying no. People kept overruling it. So, what builds up behind a wall like that for a century and a half? Not a lake, something a lot worse. A century lost. The water above Augusta went warm, and slow and foul. It turned into a holding tank for mill waste and raw sewage dumped straight in from the towns along the banks. And the smell, picture this, the smell got so bad that the workers inside the Maine State House, right there by the river, kept their windows shut through the hottest weeks of summer just to keep it out of the building.
By the 1960s, it was completely polluted. There were industrial paper mills upriver that were using this river for just raw sewage. And it literally had brought this river to the brink of death.
The state of Maine eventually spent around $100 million between 1972 and 1990, just cleaning the water back up to modern standards. $100 million to partly undo what the wall had done. And everyone still treated the river like a problem to be managed, not something that wanted to come back. And then, the strangest thing happened. The entire reason the dam existed quietly stopped mattering. By the mid-1990s, the Edwards Dam was generating 3.5 megawatts of electricity. That sounds fine, until you measure it against the whole state it was supposed to serve. 3.5 megawatts came out to 0.1% of all the power in Maine. Do the math on that. 0.1%. A wall that had choked an entire river for over a century, that killed 17 miles of habitat. That locked out a dozen species of fish, and by the end, it was keeping the lights on for what amounts to a few neighborhoods. That was the trade everyone had been defending for 160 years. So why was it still standing? And even if someone did tear it out, could a river this far gone ever really come back? That second question is the whole reason this channel exists. If real comebacks like this one are why you are here, do me a favor and hit subscribe right now. The American Wild is built for exactly this, the real, verified recoveries of this continent's rivers and forests and wildlife, the ones that actually happened every single week. Because the answer this river finally gave is the reason anyone still tells the story, and it very nearly never got the chance to give it. The only question. In 1986, the federal law changed. For the first time, the agency that licenses hydropower dams had to weigh the environmental damage a dam does against the value of the power it makes. Before that, the harm a dam did to a river basically did not show up on the books. Now it did. And once you put 3.5 megawatts on one side of the scale and a dead river on the other, that scale was not close. There had already been one obvious chance to fix this years earlier, and people blew it. In 1976, the dam breached yet again. 2 members of the Natural Resources Council of Maine looked at the broken wall and said the obvious thing out loud. Just leave it. Let the river run. They were right, more than 20 years early. Nobody with the power to act listened. The wall went back up. The river waited another 23 years. So, by the time anyone seriously pushed to take the dam out for good, they ran into a wall of a different kind. Not concrete, doubt. And the single most powerful argument against tearing it out had nothing to do with money or floods. It was 4 words. It will not work. The salmon, people said, have been gone from this river for 100 years. The shad are gone. The sturgeon are basically a memory. What on earth makes you think any of them are coming back? And here is the part that should stop you. That was a fair question, and the people fighting for removal could not answer it. Because nobody on earth had ever taken down a dam this big, on a river this dead, and watched what happened next. They were asking an entire state to gamble 17 miles of river and millions of dollars on a hunch that nature, handed the chance, would heal itself. There was only one way to find out if that was true. The coiled spring. So, the people fighting for the Kennebec did something clever. They tried to load the dice. For years before the wall ever came down, fisheries crews had been quietly stalking the river for a comeback nobody could promise. Between 1987 and 1999, the state trucked in and released nearly 644,000 adult alewives and more than 8 million American shad fry into the spawning grounds above the dam. Think about the patience in that. They were building a population in waiting.
Once we tag these fish, we'll put them into the black holding bag, carrying bags to put them into the truck. And we'll transport those up to the release site.
A coiled spring of fish sitting above a wall, ready to fire upstream the second it disappeared. All they needed was for someone to pull the wall out of the way. But first they had to win the fight to do it, and that fight got ugly. The dam's owners and the whole hydropower industry came back swinging. They argued the licensing agency had no right, legal or moral, to force a private dam down. They warned removal would erode the banks, flood the towns downstream, tank everyone's property values. Reckless, they said. Far too expensive. Then, in November of 1997, the agency did something it had never once done in its entire history. It refused to renew the dam's license, and it ordered the thing torn down. The owners got handed a brutal choice: take the dam out, or spend close to $9 million building a working fish ladder, plus another $1 million starting to repair the damage the dam had already done. For a wall producing 0.1% of the state's power, the numbers made the call by themselves. One last piece sealed it. The shipbuilder Bath Iron Works agreed to put $2.5 million toward removal in exchange for permission to fill some wetlands downstream it wanted for its own expansion. Money from heavy industry paying to set a river free. In January of 1999, ownership of the Edwards Dam got handed to the state of Maine for one single purpose: to take it apart. After 162 years, the countdown was finally running, and not one person, not the owners, not the engineers, not the interior secretary on the bank, actually knew what was about to come through that gap. The breach. Which brings us back to that July morning. More than 1,000 people lining both banks, the church bell ringing, Babbitt and Governor Angus King standing right there at the water's edge, and a backhoe biting into the earthen wall. For a few long seconds, nothing. Then a thin trickle slipped through the gap. Then the trickle turned into a torrent. And as the Kennebec broke free for the first time in 162 years, something happened that not one person on that bank had predicted.
It is absolutely amazing to me that we could be so blind to this wonderful asset for so many years, and I was part of it. And you don't really realize what a wonderful thing having a river flowing through your town is.
The sturgeon started leaping. Short-nosed sturgeon, fish whose family line runs all the way back to the age of the dinosaurs, felt the current change and threw themselves clean out of the water as the river came roaring back. The crowd lost it. People who were there describe it like the river was throwing a party for itself. And standing in the middle of all of it, Babbitt and King were watching a bet pay off in real time. King had said the whole goal was for the Kennebec to take back its place as both an economic engine and an ecological miracle. Babbitt had predicted this single removal would open a brand new chapter in how America treats its rivers. Here is what neither of them understood yet. They were lowballing it. Badly. The river answers. So the dam was gone. 17 miles of river ran free for the first time since before the Civil War. And what the river did next made tearing down the wall look like the easy part. The recovery did not take a decade. It did not wait for the next generation. It started almost the instant the water punched through. With the wall gone, the fish suddenly had 18 more miles of open water above the old dam site, all the way up to where the Sebasticook River meets the Kennebec. Atlantic sturgeon moved past the old site within weeks. Alewives and shad pressed in right behind them, running routes their ancestors had been locked out of since the 1830s. Picture that. Fish that had no living memory of the water above that wall. Not one of them had ever been up there, just read the current and went. The skeptics asked if the fish would ever come back. The fish answered before the dust settled, and this is the part that researchers still struggle to explain to people. Hand a river back its free-flowing state, and the recovery does not necessarily crawl. It can begin in moments, not months, not years. The fish do not need a map, and they do not need a memory. They feel the water start to move the way it is supposed to move, and they go. Everyone had braced for a slow, decades-long healing. The Kennebec skipped the slow part entirely, and then it got stranger. Within a single year, people spotted seals 40 miles inland from the Atlantic, chasing schools of alewives up a river that had been a biological dead zone a few months earlier. Ocean seals, 40 miles up a New England river, pulled inland because, for the first time in a century and a half, the food had finally come home. The alewives were the trigger for all of it. As the herring flooded back, everything that eats herring came surging back too. River otter, mink, bald, eagles, osprey, great blue heron, all of them following the fish upstream to the feast. Along one 5-mile stretch of the Sebasticook, biologists later counted as many as 58 bald eagles in a single day. 58. On a river that had been a sewage-choked pond inside of living memory. Sit with the eagle number for a second, because it is easy to skim past. 58 bald eagles along 5 miles of one river in one day. There are whole states where people drive for hours and feel lucky to spot a single one. Here they were stacked up wing to wing, and every one of them had come for the same reason. The fish were back, so the food was back, so the predators came home. That is what a healthy river actually looks like when you let it be one. More than 3 million alewives now run up the Sebasticook every year, so thick they can darken the shallows. The food web the wall cut apart in 1837 was stitching itself back together, piece by piece, faster than anyone had let themselves hope. But the fish and the eagles were not even the part that stunned the scientists most. The bottom returns. A few seasons in, a quieter signal showed up. The insects came back. Mayflies and stoneflies, fragile little things that can only survive in clean, cold, oxygen-rich water, returned to the Kennebec in force. And here is why that mattered more than the eagles. Those insects are the canary. They do not show up in a river that is faking it. They only appear when the water itself is genuinely clean and cold and full of oxygen, right down at the level you cannot see. So, when they came back, it meant the river was not just carrying fish through it again. It had gotten healthy all the way down at the foundation, healthy enough to rebuild itself from the very bottom of the food chain, up. Think about the order this happened in. The fish came first, because the fish were waiting. Then the predators that eat the fish. Then the scavengers. Then the slow, quiet, fragile life that takes the longest to trust an opening. Each return made the next one possible. Nobody was rebuilding this river by hand. It was rebuilding itself, off a blueprint that had been sitting intact the whole time, locked on the wrong side of a wall. Meanwhile, anglers from the local Trout Unlimited chapter were already pulling shad and striped bass out of the Kennebec the very next year. And the people came back too. Crowds gathering at the spring runs to see a river so packed with alewives you could not see the bottom. The 10-foot Atlantic sturgeon that used to be a near mythical sight turned into something you could reasonably hope to watch breach the surface right in downtown Augusta. A river people used to hold their nose around had become a river people drove hours to come and see, and the numbers behind it were about to get genuinely hard to believe. Numbers that broke the people who study these rivers for a living thought they knew what was possible here. They were wrong, and the count proved it. In 1999, the year of the breach, around 78,000 alewives came back to the Kennebec to spawn. Within a couple of decades, that run blew past 5.5 million. And in 2025, more than 9 million river herring pushed up the river in a single season. That is not a typo. 78,000 fish to more than 9 million. Sit with that gap for a second. A run that had collapsed to almost nothing, a run skeptics swore was gone for good, came back more than 100 times larger than it was on the day the wall fell. Not restored, not stabilized, multiplied past anything in the historical record anyone could point to. The same thing is now playing out on the nearby Penobscot River, where dam removals have driven the river herring count from a few thousand up towards 7 million. The Kennebec today hosts the single largest run of its kind anywhere in North America. And once one river proves a thing like that is even possible, the question stops being whether it works. It becomes how far it can spread. A national movement. It spread fast. 25 years on, what happened on the Kennebec refused to stay one town story. 9 years after Edwards came down, the Fort Halifax Dam upstream came out too, after a brutal 5-year court fight, opening still more of the Sebasticook. Over on the Penobscot, the Great Works and Vesey dams fell in 2012 and 2013. Together, those projects reopened roughly 2,000 miles of habitat to fish that had been shut out for the better part of 2 centuries. And every single removal was easier to argue than the last, because every one of them had Edwards standing behind it as proof. Now look at the scale of what is left. The United States is covered in more than 500,000 dams. The average one is already past 60 years old. Thousands of them sit in bad shape, quietly aging toward the day they fail on their own. A lot of them do not do anything anymore. The mills they powered closed decades ago, and fixing an old dam often costs far more than just taking it out. So The whole question has flipped. It used to be, can a river survive without its dam? Now it is, can anyone justify keeping a dam that does nothing but block a river and wait to break? And the country has started answering. In both 2019 and 2024, a record 108 dams were pulled out across the United States in a single year, freeing rivers in more than 24 states at once. Think about that pace, more than 2 a week, every week, for a whole year, twice. What began as one impossible fight in Augusta had quietly become the new normal. But there is one reason Edwards still stands above all of them: what they tore down. Since 1999, close to 2,000 dams have come out across the country, a huge number of them inspired directly by what one small dam in Maine proved could be done. And to this day, Edwards remains the only time the federal agency has ever forced a hydropower dam down against its owner's will. That one decision is the legal precedent that made every removal after it even thinkable. And the work on the Kennebec still is not finished. In 2025, the Nature Conservancy and a renewable power company announced a deal to take out 4 more dams on the lower Kennebec, opening hundreds more miles of river for the Atlantic salmon still barely hanging on in these waters. So go back one last time to that church bell on July 1st, 1999, and the sturgeon flinging themselves into the morning light while the Interior Secretary stood on the bank and watched. What those people really tore down that day was never just a wall of timber and concrete. They tore down an idea. The idea that once you build something, it has to stand forever. The idea that a river, once silenced, can never come back. The Kennebec proved both of those wrong, and it did it in under a year. Today the water runs clear right past the windows of the State House, the same windows that used to stay shut against the smell. And on a good spring morning, you can stand in Augusta and watch a 10-foot Atlantic sturgeon break the surface in the exact spot a dam stood for 162 years. Think about how close that came to never happening. The same fish, in the same water, that an entire generation of experts had written off as gone forever. The river knew what it was the whole time. It was only ever waiting for somebody to get out of the way. That is the part that should stay with you. Nothing exotic saved this river. No miracle technology, no decades of careful reconstruction. Somebody simply stopped holding it back, and it did the rest itself, faster than anyone believed it could. Which means the same thing is sitting dormant in a few 100,000 other rivers right now, waiting on the same single decision. If you want to keep watching this continent come back to life, subscribe to The American Wild and stick around, because there are dozens more rivers across America facing this exact decision right now. So here's the question I will leave you with. If one small dam in Maine could rewrite the rules for an entire country, which river do you think should run free next? Tell me in the comments.